Welcome to this week's edition of Good Books Radio. Audiobooks.com is the chief underwriter for Good Books Radio, which is produced by UTRGV Media Services for Rio Grande Valley Public Radio. And now, here's your host, Dr. John Cook.
Welcome once again to another edition of Good Books Radio. I'm your host this week, Dr. John Cook, and with me today, a very kind author calling in at 6 a.m. on a Saturday morning from Hong Kong. We have Stephen Wong, who's a lifelong collector of historical baseball artifacts, who authored Smithsonian Baseball Inside the World's Finest Private Collections, which was nominated for the Casey Award. Wong has lent his experience to numerous baseball exhibitions, including those at the Museum of the City of New York, at the Yogi Berra Museum, my favorite, and Learning Center, and the National Museum of American Jewish History. The book is called Game Worn. It is a wonderful Smithsonian book full of impressive photos of collector's items, baseball uniforms, and baseball players from throughout the 20th century. And that's what we're here to talk about today. Mr. Wong, welcome to the program.
Hey, thanks for having me, John.
This is so much fun for me because I so love the game of baseball. And I got a little bit richer on the history of it because of how well written this is, with so many of the greats throughout the 20th century. Let's talk about them era by era a little bit. The dead ball era is the first one. That's 1900 to 1919. And it was called the dead ball era because back then baseballs had a rubber center and it was kind of hard to hit them out of the park, right?
Yeah, that's true. And also because the ball was used, a single ball was used virtually for the entire game. Mm-hmm. Obviously, that today, when the ball hits the dirt, let's say a pitcher would throw it, and it would hit the dirt, the catcher would always, give the ball to the umpire and he would check it. Mm-hmm. So you have several instances in today's game where the ball is constantly changed. But back in the dead ball era, they would use a ball literally until it was deformed. Mm-hmm. So the pitcher, when spitballs were allowed, would scuff the ball with tobacco juice, all sorts of things, so that when they threw it, it would, move in the air in much like a screwball.
Uh-huh. That just makes me ill.
That was yeah, exactly, because it was a very different game back in the dead ball era, and pitchers would do anything, scuff the ball, tobacco juice on it, all sorts of things, until it literally would become very dark. Mm-hmm. And that was one of the reasons back in the day they called it the dead ball era, because the balls were used so much they would become soft and deformed. And this was the day before Babe Ruth, obviously, that launching home runs. It was really a scientific game, which was really to advance the runner and get hits by hits, bunts, and just to advance the runners to home before the game of that Babe Ruth popularized with the home run.
Mm-hmm. Now, this era, first 20 years of the 20th century, a lot of these guys were playing ball in part to escape the tough life in the coal mines or the manufacturing plants, weren't they? They were pretty rough guys.
They were. George F. Will, who was one of the great authors and historians and political consultants, was interviewed on Ken Burns' video Baseball that was produced and launched in 1994. And he made a comment that back in the day, in the dead ball era in particular, many Americans, they were immigrants coming from Europe. And for a lot of them, they were working in the coal mines in Pittsburgh and all throughout, parts of the United States. So baseball was a way out of the coal mines for many of these players. And if you look at a number of the players back in the dead ball era, their names, Honus Wagner, Germany Schaefer, they were obviously of Irish descent, German descent, Italian descent, and many of them again had jobs that were just quite humble, barely making ends meet. And baseball was a way for them to better their lives and sort of get out of the coal mines and make a better living. So very different from today.
And spikes were a serious weapon during this era too, as I read about.
Yeah, we have one chapter dedicated to Ty Cobb, which I aptly titled "Something Like a War." Mm-hmm. Cobb was obviously a ferocious player in the context of that. It was akin to war for him. Mm-hmm. There's a number of quotes that even Cobb himself. Baseball is something like a war. Baseball is a red-blooded sport for red-blooded men. It's not pink tea, and mollycoddles had better stay out of it. It's a struggle for supremacy, a survival of the fittest. Mm-hmm. That was a quote from Ty Cobb, and you can imagine how he approached the game with that sort of mentality and philosophy. But we have a photograph in Ty Cobb's chapter, which we featured his sweater that he wore around the 1920 season, along with his bat, which we, aptly called, one of his weapons, and obviously his spike.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he spiked a lot of people, but he took scars too, to some extent. He thought it was all part of the game. Yeah, I was interested in another one that took spikes because Christy Mathewson said of Frank Chance, if he had to choose between accepting a pair of spikes in a vital part of his anatomy or getting a put out, he would always take the put out.
That's very true. Again, and you read about a lot of these players from the dead ball era. Many of them played very hard. Today we sort of admire a lot of the athletes today in various sports, be it American football, basketball, and baseball for their athletic prowess. Reality is back in the day in baseball in the dead ball era, these players were extremely intense. And they played very, very hard. And again, I go back to the notion: a lot of these men who played the game were hard men. From the coal mines. In the case of Frank Chance, he was a brawler. Mm-hmm. Many of them, these are rough diamonds. So imagine putting a set of those guys on the baseball diamond and playing a game in a time where literally. You had to play very, very hard and perform just to keep your job.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Ty Cobb's sweater. This era had such a wide variety of styles and fabrics of uniform. I'm looking at Harry Hooper's Red Sox Mackinaw coat, the brightly colored red coat that he wore, and I guess there were times when you needed a coat on the baseball field.
Yes, well. That's the beauty of this book is that, the uniform constitutes many things beyond what we normally see, which is, the wool flannel jersey and the pants. It includes, obviously, the hat, the stirrup socks, and in many cases, like the sweater, like you see in the Ty Cobb chapter, but also this beautiful red Mackinaw coat that Harry Hooper wore in the 1912 World Series. The World Series was obviously played in October, so late in the year, and in places like the East Coast, oftentimes the weather was quite cold. Mm-hmm. So players would be wearing these things before and post and after the game to keep themselves warm. This was a case where in Harry Hooper, this is the only known surviving jacket from that World Series, mm-hmm. and it was worn by Harry Hooper, who, as you know, is a Hall of Fame player, one of the greatest players in Boston Red Sox history. And on page 30, you can see that we managed to find a photo of Game 1 of the 1912 World Series, which was played at the Polo Grounds in New York, mm-hmm. where the Boston Red Sox team is wearing that coat, featured on page 28, walking out onto the field. Just prior to Game 1, where the Red Sox played against Christy Mathewson and Ruth Marquardt and all the greats of that era.
Oh, let's talk a bit about Christy Mathewson, because despite how rough and rugged some of the players were, Christy Mathewson was really a gentleman and a good Christian by all accounts.
He was. He was known as the Christian gentleman. That was one of his nicknames. He had several nicknames, including the Big Six. Christian gentleman seemed to resonate. He was a very respected all-around hero of the time. He was tall, handsome, college-educated. He went to Bucknell, and he basically helped. He was a catalyst to help transform the rough and rowdy world of baseball into a chivalrous sport, essentially. And there were many quotes. Grantland Rice often said that Mathewson brought something to baseball no one else had ever given to the game. He handed the game a certain touch of class and indefinable lift and culture, brains and personality. There was a famous dime store character, Frank Merriwell, which the authors back in the day would sort of use Christy Mathewson as their modern day Frank Merriwell. Again, in a time where most of the players were quite rough, Mathewson again brought a certain chivalrous and character to the game that you don't see oftentimes in that era.
Mm-hmm.
So certainly he was quite an exception to many of the players of that time.
Yeah. We're more familiar with later contributions, but in 1919, Branch Rickey was wearing a Cardinals uniform, and he was an extraordinary man in terms of his education and his cultured background and his faith as well.
Yes, he was a devout Christian, and hence I thought it would be interesting to feature Branch Rickey's jersey with an original 1920s Holy Bible, which you'll see on page 50 of the book. Rickey is one of the most interesting characters, I think, in baseball history, often overlooked. I mean, he's obviously most well known for integrating the game with Jackie Robinson in 1947. But Rickey, was born to a deeply religious family in South Central Ohio. He was named after John Wesley, who was the founder of the family's Methodist faith. Mm-hmm. And his middle name, Branch, was indicative, of the Christian values by which he would live his, entire life. And, it's because of that deep, devout religious faith, one of the reasons, in addition to the fact that Rickey was a very sharp businessman, very opportunistic, and quite a pragmatic person. And being a pragmatic person, you'd had to do things as a decision maker in ways to increase ticket sales at the ballpark. Mm-hmm. So it's a combination of a number of factors why Rickey was so committed to integrating the game the way he did with Jackie Robinson. But it also took a man of deep religious faith and principle to actually have the courage to carry that through. Mm-hmm. Hence, I thought an appropriate metaphor for Rickey was, Sir Thomas More, A Man for All Seasons, which was, a play that was from 1960. It was written, by Robert Bolt, mm-hmm. Where his character was really, Bolt's play was based on a true story of Sir Thomas More, who was the 16th century Chancellor of England. More refused to endorse King Henry VIII's wish to divorce his wife, who could not bear him a son, and then marry the sister of his former mistress. And Bolt depicts More as a man of unyielding principle and a man who remains true to himself and his beliefs despite monumental external pressures. So he calls him, the consummate man for all seasons. And I thought that sort of metaphor really applied to Branch Rickey.
Indeed.
What he did.
And I don't know if people know how much he did for the farm system. It really flourished thanks to the work he put in for his team.
He did. I mean, Rickey was essentially the founder, of the farm system. Rickey's life, included a number of pursuits, but one of the key things, aside from integrating baseball, and not a lot of people, John, know about this, was he was really the father of the farm systems. In the summer of 1919, right when he sort of wore the jersey that's featured in the book, he was instrumental in really forming the farm club. By the early 1920s, the Cardinals farm club system was flourishing. It had about 800 players under contract and about 32 teams. And and the results were extraordinary. So from 1919 to about 1942, under Rickey's stewardship, the Cardinals won 6 National League pennants and 4 World Series titles, and the rest of the league eventually followed Rickey's lead in the farm club, and today farm clubs are quite standard practice. But it was really because of the farm club and the way of that he would be platooning players and whatnot that led to the Cardinals' success back in the day.
Mm-hmm. One more thing, and this is the sad part of 1919, is when the gambler, Sport Sullivan, I guess, met up with one of the White Sox and offered money to throw the World Series.
I think this is one of the most interesting points in baseball history, quite frankly. A lot of people would consider it the most darkest chapter in baseball history. You had Shoeless Joe Jackson and 7 of his teammates conspired to throw the 1919 World Series against the Cincinnati Reds. And, the uniform that we feature in the book was the entire full home Chicago White Sox uniform that Red Faber wore not only in Game 1 of that infamous series, which was actually played at Redland Field in Cincinnati, but the White Sox actually wore their home uniforms for that game, even though it was an away game.
Mm-hmm.
Red Faber was elected to the Hall of Fame. He was one of the last legally allowed spitball pitchers of the time. Was a phenomenal pitcher. He actually did not pitch in the 1919 series because he was ill, suffering from influenza. But he attended every single game and sat, in the dugout with his teammates, wearing that uniform featured on page 55.
Yeah.
It's so significant because, think about what he had witnessed sitting in the dugout wearing that uniform at Game 1 at Redland Field during the series. He witnessed Eddie Seacott hit the first Reds batter, Maury Rath, which was a signal to the gamblers that the fix was in. And, the rest is history. He basically witnessed the tragedy unfolding at the seams. And then after the season, he wore that uniform for the entire 1920 season as well. And like I said earlier, he was one of the greatest pitchers of his era, and having been elected to the Hall of Fame, and to this day, a very respected, one of the most respected moundsmen of his time.
Yeah. It occurred to me as I was reading what a tightwad Comiskey was with his White Sox players, that of course they would have extra temptation to take bribes. I mean, that's not an excuse, surely, but he never spent much money on them. In fact, they would play till their socks were dirty, which is why they became called the Black Sox in part. I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah, it's very true. Look, the reality is that Charles Comiskey today is revered, obviously because of the many things he did, owning, the Chicago White Sox. You had Comiskey Park out of Chicago, which has been, which was home to the White Sox for many, many decades.
Mm-hmm.
Reality is that despite the club's, success, the White Sox players were very unhappy and very disillusioned, in 1919, and most likely even before that. They were paid very poorly by Comiskey. He showed nothing but disdain for his players. And, back in the day, John, these players were bound to him by the reserve clause. You had many incidences where, for example, Eddie Seacott, he was promised by Comiskey a $10,000 bonus if you won 30 games in a season. So in 1919, after Seacott secured his 29th victory, Comiskey benched him.
Yeah.
So he wouldn't have to pay the bonus.
Yeah.
These are just things which obviously over the course of years really, ate away at the players, and was one of the reasons I think that turned a lot of them, to make some quick money in the 1919 series, and eventually agreeing to throw the game for Arnold Rothstein and his syndicate of gamblers.
Mm-hmm. And I was surprised. I didn't know that they were bound. I was surprised when I read, Shoeless Joe Jackson was about as good a hitter as Ty Cobb, so he probably, in the modern era, could have gone to any team he wanted to.
Jackson is definitely one of the greatest hitters in baseball history. In fact, Ted Williams, made it almost a lifetime mission for him after he was elected to the Hall of Fame in 1966. Williams was one of the very strong advocates to try to get Shoeless Joe Jackson into the Hall, claiming that he, really did not participate in the so-called fix of the 1919 World Series, because if you look at his batting performance and the way he played during the series, the statistics and the results were totally contrary to throwing the series.
Right, and
let alone the fact that he had one of the highest lifetime batting averages in baseball history, and in 1911, hitting a remarkable, I believe it was 408. One of the very few hitters in baseball history to hit over 400. Mm-hmm. And certainly, we haven't seen a player hit over 400 since Ted Williams did it in 1941. Prior to Williams doing that in 41, you had a handful of players to achieve that benchmark, from Rogers, Hornsby, Bill Terry, and Ty Cobb, but certainly Shoeless Jackson was one of them. Mm-hmm. So Jackson is certainly, John, I tell you, you talk about dream uniforms. What do I wake up in the morning, or go to bed at night dreaming about? And that would be obviously to find Shoeless Joe Jackson's game-worn uniform. Mm-hmm. I don't think it exists. Certainly, it's never surfaced to this day. But boy, that would be incredible.
Yeah, it would. And it's funny you say dreams, because I think about the Field of Dreams, and Kevin Costner's speech to his daughter was about how Shoeless Joe Jackson played too well to have been in on the fix. That was something he made a big deal about. So I don't want to spend all the time on this era, and we spent half our time, but I want to say, millions of people were disillusioned by that scandal. And I think if there hadn't been a Babe Ruth, we wouldn't have rejuvenated baseball nearly as fast as we did.
That's very true. And, it just so happened that we were exceedingly lucky and fortunate not only to have the Red Sabre uniform featured in the book, but the chapter right after that is Babe Ruth's New York Yankees road jersey that he wore in the 1920 season, mm-hmm. which is one of the most coveted artifacts in baseball collecting, let alone Americana.
Didn't that go for several $1 million to some collector?
It did. And, the owner of the jersey, who is okay for me to say who it is Mr. Thomas Toll, mm-hmm. who is a very prominent businessman in the Los Angeles area. But Mr. Toll had acquired this uniform at public auction. And I'll tell you, John, every time I look at it, I do get goosebumps, because not only was it worn by Babe Ruth, but the fact is that it was worn probably in one of the most critical inflection points in baseball history. Coming off the Black Sox scandal, after the 1919 World Series, everyone knew that something was not right. And it was everywhere in the press that the series either could have been or was fixed. Mm-hmm. Mathewson and a number of the press people were in the press box and wrote several articles about this series, that it was just not right. Things were wrong. Players were not doing what they were supposed to do, and it just had a stench to it. So after that, you can imagine in 1920, baseball attendance just plummeted. People lost confidence and thought the game was just crooked. People felt lost confidence. They stayed away from the ballparks around the country, and just had no interest in seeing it, given the fact of what happened in the 1919 World Series. Well, enter George Herman Babe Ruth, right? A big, gawky, and decidedly proletarian man who basically came from the Boston Red Sox, signed by the New York Yankees, and he just brings the home run and popularizes it. From the dead ball era, the scientific game, which was one of its key catalysts was really John McGraw, the famous manager of the New York Giants. In comes Babe Ruth and just launches the live ball era. And he, basically brought people back to the ballpark because people of all ages around the country were so enamored with Babe Ruth, not only because of the way he carried himself and because he was such a charismatic individual, but through the home run. People had never seen such power displayed in a player. And, he was just launching home runs after home runs. And they never saw or never witnessed the game like that. And Ruth was critical in reinstilling confidence back in the game and bringing people back to the ballpark. And the jersey featured on page 61 of the book was the jersey that he wore in that very critical season. And it's displayed with one of his bats that he used during that era, which was obviously the tools of his trade and the medium in which he launched those home runs.
And amazing figure, and I as a kid was in awe of the Yankee Stadium that they no longer use, the house that Ruth built. I've only got like 4 or 5 minutes left, but I want to touch on a couple of people that have been prominent in my own watching of baseball. And you mentioned Dizzy Dean and what a pitcher he was, and Pee Wee Reese, and they used to be a broadcast team extraordinaire. Pee Wee will always remember for putting his arm around Jackie Robinson, and Diz for his talent and his coined phrases, I guess, as much as anything else.
Yeah, Dizzy Dean, to me, John, was one of the most interesting characters in baseball history. This is a man who I felt personally, John, sort of embodies the Depression era. That's why I just found Dean so interesting. He was a natural phenomenon. The way, as you mentioned earlier, the way he spoke, the coined his phrases and whatnot. He was essentially a folk hero whose showmanship and his coined phrases inspired audiences nationwide, not only on radio but on television broadcasts as well. When television came about, and as you say, he was a broadcaster. As much as Babe Ruth had embodied, the vivacious spirit of, the Roaring '20s, so to speak. Mm-hmm. It was, Dizzy Dean's humble beginnings, his self-confidence, his bravado that appealed to a country on its knees from the devastation of the Great Depression. Mm-hmm. It's funny because when you look at both Babe Ruth and Dizzy Dean, fans were in awe of Ruth. They were just gasped by what he could do. They were just in awe of him. But it was really Dizzy Dean to whom fans could relate, particularly at a time of need. And so I think that's one of the main reasons why I think Dean is such an important character. Outside of his stats and outside of the fact he was such a great pitcher, he was much more than that. He was really one of the greatest folk heroes of the Depression era.
This is such a page turner, and I can tell our listeners that as I was reading this, each page I would turn and say, "Oh yeah, of course he's in there." Ernie Banks, Hank Aaron, Mickey Mantle, Roger Maris, Bob Gibson, Sandy Koufax. There's so many great names in here, and I was really excited, thinking, well, we're going to get to my favorite pitchers with the Braves, Glavine, Maddox, and Smoltz, but there just wasn't room for them with everybody else you had, I reckon. But it's such a delight and such a joy to read this book, and I'm glad we got Rod Carew in because he was an extraordinary fellow as well. There's also this wonderful compendium in the back of patches and uniforms from throughout the eras that you discussed that just makes this such a fabulous book. I think it's a coffee table book, and I think you'd be proud to display it on your coffee table, and it'll make somebody a great Christmas gift. The book is called Game Worn Baseball Treasures. We've been privileged to be talking with Stephen Wong, a man who's clearly very knowledgeable on the sport. I'm your host, Dr. John Cook. I remind you, if you don't hear our regular broadcast of Good Books Radio, you can catch us on YouTube, and our channel is Good Books Radio, Strong and Cook. I'm your host, Dr. John Cook. Thanks for listening.